Howdy of you delicious people. Howdy of you delicious people. I'm here to review a 2009 film called Gamer. Reasonably, I had seen this movie in theaters when it came out. Without a doubt, while going into this movie, I just remember after watching this film and seeing it with my sister. So ultimately, I went into the theater and I saw this movie with my sister, and ultimately, after watching this movie with my sister in theaters, she's like, "What is wrong with you? Like, why did you have me go see this movie?" And I'm like, it looked really cool." Like, dude, I love video game movies, and I thought it was really cool. She's like, I didn't like that. I didn't like this movie. I thought it was. It's like, okay, so I like weird films. I can't. I can't enjoy mainstream things. I can't enjoy. I have to. I have to have something that like has to like severely visually stimulate me, or has something that is different than everything else. And ultimately, I think around that time, as per usual with every single movie going out in theaters, there's not much out. And plus, now there's even lesser things that are out now, more so than there was before. Everything is just being shoved right into a streaming service now because, sadly enough, like, there's not much else everyone can do. So, speaking of streaming, ultimately, where can you go to find this and go out of your way to eventually see this movie if ultimately you have the ability to? Well, ultimately on Hulu, it ultimately breaks down to tell me that this movie is on Cinemax. More than likely, you can go on Hulu or you can ultimately go on Amazon and ultimately see Cinemax for probably a free trial of sorts ultimately to see this movie. Or reasonably, you could probably go on a Movie Pro or a Movie Playbox and see this movie for absolutely free without any kind of subscriptions of any sorts. Because ultimately, I went into Movie Pro and I went in there and saw this movie and I was like, yeah, I already had this movie on DVD or whatever it came out to be. Um, when it came out, because I'm ultimately like, yeah, I liked this movie. I enjoyed it. And ultimately, it was just I liked Terry Crews in this movie. I liked Gerard Butler in this film, and I liked the whole like video game concept of it. And once I heard it was like a video game, like kind of movie, I'm like, oh wow, like I like these kinds of films. Reasonably, you could probably look at this game and see that any number of things were probably done afterwards to kind of maybe at some points maybe quasi be close or mimic this kind of game, but reasonably there is only one game or movie that that is like this. So going into this film, we really break down to tell you that there is a crap ton of adult content on here, whether it's gruesome violence, whether it is also gruesome things just going on with anybody. Basically, this movie, much more so, basically rents out a human being to be portrayed in any way of which a other person wants to have a person being portrayed with basically being under the guise of otherwise another name. So reasonably, we have some person who is sitting at home controlling another human being, and ultimately they can live in utter privacy, or otherwise they can eventually grow to a immersive popularity to where ultimately women and stuff is just being thrown out them consistently. So going on into this film, I thought that this movie was fun. I thought that this movie ultimately at some points there are some gross out moments because there forcibly has to be those gross out moments, but Recently, there is also some interesting points going on with this movie to showcase what quite possibly a future could be with gaming. How in all actuality maybe it's going to get to the point where a virtual reality of sorts, or a reality that isn't really real enough, isn't going to be good enough. So at some point you're going to have somebody come in and make a actual reality out of reality. So going into this film, we have Michael C. Hall, who plays Ken Castle, that uh, puts up two different kind of games. And we have it to where we have this thing called Society, where it's kind of like Sims, but with real people in a real portion of world. That ultimately people can do any number of things, maybe run somebody over, uh, maybe injure someone, and ultimately this person has to be a sim through all this and just kind of has to be put through all this. Recently, at a lot of points in time, people have to be romantically entangled within this society, and that is where the real things come in. Ultimately, anybody could be playing as seemingly a person that is walking around this entire town with basically nothing on. Or reasonably the entire time we just have a persona and or person that ultimately is wearing clothes that they would not ever wear in any part of the world ever, because ultimately they would be arrested uh, for indecent exposure or this and that and whatever what have you. So we have that portion of world, we have society, and then we also have this game called Slayers, where we have seemingly death row inmates that ultimately are going to probably spend the rest of their life in prison. So this is kind of like Death Race, ultimately the Jason Statham film, kind of tying into reasonably another film which I also do enjoy as well. So we have this game called Slayers, which ultimately the voice of the Slayers thing is done by Keith David, which ultimately we'll see him later on in the film, which I thought was like, yeah, like Keith David. Ultimately Keith David was in the Saints Row video games, and like ultimately when going into this is like, yeah, Keith David, Chronicles of Riddick, and They Live, and all kinds of interesting stuff. So being a part of this game, uh, where recently I was like, okay, like dude, he did the voice, and then now he's in a role. Like, do you not realize how like the same guy did two things for? Anyways, so going on into here, I guess they just had to just kind of figure out some role that eventually Keith David would play in here, because they're like, dude, like we'll have you as the voice of this thing, but we're gonna have you come in later and just do a role. Just we're just gonna have to makeshift you in here somewhere, because that's probably what they did. They're probably like, dude, hey, we would love to have you in this movie. We're just gonna make a role for you and just shove you in here, and you'll just be that guy. Ultimately, that's what I naturally assumed happened. So we have this game called Slayers with death row inmates, where ultimately they have to basically kill and or shoot one another, and whoever makes it to this escape point ultimately lives to seemingly be in prison for another day. And so reasonably, I guess this is for the Slayer game is probably for the Fortune 500 people that are rich people anyways, that can just kind of blow money on this Slayer Esh-like game. We ultimately have Simon, who we find out is actually in control of Cable. And we end up finding out that the Slayers, which ultimately is Gerard Butler's character, he's Cable. Uh, we ultimately find out that Simon ultimately is actually pulling all the strings, telling Cable exactly what to do, and because ultimately we have it to where Gerard Butler's brain is hotwired into this game system. We find out that there are some nanites that are put into someone's brain to ultimately have someone else control them. They break the whole thing down in the very beginning of this movie to ultimately let us know, like, okay, like, somebody else can be in control of someone's mind and do whatever they want. So, eventually we have to where there is also a society of the humans that ultimately want to take down Ken Castle, which is ultimately Michael C. Hall's character, because Michael C. Hall, of course, is just like uh, is a $1 billion character that ultimately can fund things and fund the news, and ultimately can do interviews with the news whenever he wants, and ba 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 ba. So Kira Sedgwick is ultimately in this movie, which ultimately was like, yeah, like very rarely do you see her ever really do much of films or stuff like that. I remember her in the movie Phenomenon with John Travolta, and so now I see her in this film. I'm like, oh, hey, great. Realizing that also probably during this time she was probably maybe doing the show Closer while she was also doing this. I think reasonably probably the reason why she did this movie is probably because a lot of the stuff that she was doing in this role was kind of fun, and really a lot of the stuff was just kind of visually interesting. Like some of the costumes and stuff that would be approached through any number of these characters were just kind of wild and crazy. So along with any number of any other things were just wild and crazy to visually seek your teeth into. So going on into this, we have to where we find out uh, Cable has a wife and daughter, Abby, uh, or Angie, and she ultimately is forcibly a part of a game as well, society. And so ultimately now we push on to have her eventually get her life back together while also desperately hoping that Cable is going to come back home to her. So very interesting story, but the kind of the way of which at some points that it delivers is not for everybody. There is some dark and grungy and gritty stuff going on in this movie, so I could recommend it to people, but when also looking at it, it might not be for everyone. Because when looking at it, there might be some visuals or some imagery, which ultimately people will be like, oh no, why are you recommending this? At the end of the day, that's all I could say. Is just it was an interesting movie to me, visually stimulating movie to me that I otherwise enjoyed, and I couldn't avoid not only watching it when it came out in theaters, but then eventually getting a copy of it to eventually watch at some point again, which ultimately in the end that's what I did today. So, anyways, let's go into that double 5 point count because ultimately there's a lot of crap to ultimately kind of spew out here and to get through and try to tell you. So, let's go into that spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I can spoil this movie. So, as if I was doing like lipstick or whatever on that time. Anyways, so we ultimately at first have the very much breakdown of the society and the Slayers. Ultimately, also the breakdown of the creator, which is Michael C. Hall's character, through interviews and such, which I've already kind of break down that stuff already. So moving on. We ultimately have Ken Castle, who is again Michael C. Hall's character, that is getting an interview from Gina, who is again Kira Sedgwick. Ultimately, they are talking about Kira and her cohorts of the news thing are talking about how they effing have interviews and how they effing have stuff and all this effing stuff, which I thought was hilarious. I thought was funny how like everybody's like, yeah, we better effing have it. And yeah, we have it. We effing have it. So it's just like the escalation of words that are coming on into the early parts of this movie is like hilarious to me. So we have Ken Castle that is doing this interview where ultimately it's just another formulaic interview, basically about the Slayers and how they're like is like isn't it that they're killing people and blah blah, isn't this wrong and blah 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 blah. It's like, well, Ken Castle breaks down. It's like, well, yeah, but we had the approval of a ton of people that were completely okay with the Slayer show, and that ultimately they were completely okay with eventually having to release these people after several cases, which of course Gerard Butler's character Cable ultimately is just seemingly far away from. So we eventually break in within this interview to have Ludacris's character, the human broadcaster, who is breaking into this interview to to disparage or to try to downplay or try to what is the word? Try to give some crap to Ken Castle's character, ultimately mentioning that he's a liar and he's a manipulator and and all this jazz and stuff like that, showcasing um, like this guy is as good as a toilet and ba 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 ba. So really, Ken Castle's character is just kind of like, oh, these guys are funny. Oh, hey, yeah, yeah, these guys are good. Oh, yeah, good for them that they're trying this. And ultimately, Ken Castle talks to Gene and is like, yeah, how about I like go into your firewall to see like how these guys got through here. But ultimately, Ken was letting this guy talk and say all of his say what all he needed to say. So, anyways, because it seems like these humans are trying to crack into everything. So we eventually have it to where Castle is repeatedly, when he makes it through these exit points, he eventually is getting hauled away through this truck to where numerous times people are telling them who his name is, or ultimately, uh, people are calling him Cable, and he's ultimately telling them my name isn't Cable, it's Tillman, or Tillsman. I think at some point it's either Tillman or Tillsman. I can't remember which one it is. But anyways, so we have in here that Gerard Butler's character, of course, is wanting to get back to his life, wanting to get back to reality. It's not like he's relishing in killing people and this and that. So we have to where eventually we have this person that is when Cable is in, or when Gerard Butler character Tillsman is in prison, we have a person that is coming in to tell him information that ultimately they know full well that this person knows full well that he has a wife and a daughter, and here's a photo of it. Here's a photo of them, and ultimately they ask for his autograph, and they get a blood sample from him because it's worth more, and that ultimately they are going to try to help him, and this and that. This person, this secret person, is whispering to Cable. So we have it to where eventually we find out within this game that while Cable is going through these matches, eventually Cable is seeing a woman that is seemingly soon going to be in jeopardy, and we have the player who queues up Cable trying to save this person, and but this person ends up dying needlessly anyways, to where the gamer replies, "Hey, I tried." So ultimately we have it to where there is a woman that ultimately tells Cable her name, to ultimately, within this same match, ending up getting her head blown off and killed. And I'm like, oh man, that sucks. I'm hey, that sucked that she ended up dying. I would hope that she would have made it, but I guess it doesn't matter who makes it, and as long as Cable does. So going through this whole scene, we have seemingly all heck breaking loose. Guys with giant machine, machine weapons, and or like big, uh, like Call of Duty Gear of War kind of like weapons that are just blasting through everybody and just making their way through like people like they're just standing still. But Gerard Butler again makes it through, of course, another exit point, and we have it seemingly where now Ken Castle is thinking like, well, we need to up the ante. We need to get a real, true, legitimate threat in here that ultimately doesn't need the ping of a player. And so now they bring in Hackman, Terry Crews's character, to ultimately now be gunning for Cable. To ultimately, when Hackman meets Cable seemingly in a bathroom, Hackman is completely naked because, of course, Terry Crews had said like he wanted to be naked within the scene, so that way it seemed even much more unsettling, for not only the viewer but also even for when Hackman like shows himself to Gerard Butler, and Gerard Butler is even like, "What the fuck?" Like he's looking at him like, "What are you doing?" So we ultimately have Terry Crews, who ultimately mentions, we ultimately have Hackman, who talks to Cable and mentions that he had killed someone, and that ultimately he is letting Cable know that he has no strings. As you can see, there are no strings on him. The old Pinocchio song, which ultimately was used also in Age of Ultron. And I was like, oh wow, that's like really cool, like a real play on words. Like every single thing that is kind of used in this story is to kind of placate that people are under their control or under their skin, and that's kind of like the best thing about this whole thing is you got some people that are really placating certain songs to drive the story or to keep telling the story, and in a very off or weird or funny way. But anyways, so pushing on, we find out that reasonably, Cable's wife is a part of society, and she is ultimately being forcibly played by some seemingly, I guess you would call him overweight-ish like person, that is just kind of just sitting home shirtless, eating waffles, and ultimately like this character is presented as reasonably a mess, to ultimately maybe disgust people. And I'm like, okay, why why go through this journey of like, I guess to show equality, if you're gonna show like women with that are half clothed, that are six pack abs, it's like, why not also show the other side of the world, where of course like, hey, maybe this is the uh ballparkingly quasi typical gamer that may be a little bit on the heavier side and blah 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 blah. Doesn't have any like real good looks to his name, hence why he puts on this persona of a woman that is, of course, seemingly less than scantily clad, to otherwise just end up being in this society where this girl is consistently on the prowl for any man and or woman that will ultimately just be with them. And funny enough, we have it to where within this society that ultimately in just the middle of the street somewhere, like people could start making out and start doing any number of things. Because ultimately we have it to where when this girl gets together with somebody, like they're basically already just like, well, like, should we go somewhere? Should we go to somewhere secluded and just like go and devour one another? And where ultimately the person, of course, with the pig nose replies like, "Well, are we already somewhere?" So like right in the middle of nowhere, they just kind of go at it and just I'm like, okay, like yeah, I guess just right in the middle of the street, just kind of go at it. Um, but yeah, but at some points we see some people getting freaking knocked to the f out by like rollerblades and all kinds of stuff. We see people that ultimately get like scarred on the or like scraped on the knee, and they're just laughing it off because recently the personas of which that they're placating, it's like ha ha ha, yeah, I scraped up my simulated character. I don't care. I didn't get hurt. So pushing on to eventually having Angie, while having to be seduced by this pig nosed man, we have her the entire time looking at the photo of Cable and just remembering like this is what she's doing this for. Is to ultimately get back on her feet, to ultimately get her daughter back, because ultimately her daughter had been taken away by uh, social services, and so recently this girl was forced to work in society to try to get enough money together to get her daughter back, which ultimately when she tries to get her daughter back, the caseworker that ultimately I know from being human and also being in a Star Wars game and all kinds of other things, Dexter as well as Michael C. Hall being in this movie, of course, from Dexter, which ultimately I know him from, and I emphatically enjoy that show. So we ultimately have the caseworker ultimately telling Angie, it's like, dude, you're never gonna get your daughter back. Like, if anything, whoever your daughter is with now is the family's really wealthy. She will never want for anything. And what would she exactly want with you? Like, you're the bottom feeding part of the world, and also your husband is has gone away for being put away for life in prison, but eventually he's going to soon get out. Like, there's no way that this daughter should be placed back into this into people and into your hands. So we we find out that reasonably within this movie, we find out the gamer who is controlling Cable. We find out that this guy is seemingly has his own kind of, if Cable is on the poster of every single uh, Slayer whatever thing, we also have Simon, who is heavily popular as well. I'm sure he has on all his social media is just thousands upon thousands of people all just like, oh my god, this guy's amazing, woohoo. Basically, we have it to where Simon ends up coming in for his round of playing, but before that, he needs to chat with some people that ultimately are consistently either hacking into his hacking into him to be able to talk to him, or reasonably there are people that are consistently trying to offer him things to make it appealing for him to give up his persona, his Cable, his character. And reasonably through a lot of times, there's a lot of women that are basically just throwing themselves at him consistently. Or we also have his own sister that is kind of giving him crap, and reasonably so. So, but reasonably, we also find out that this guy, like, reasonably is having people, like, women are desperately wanting their chest to be autographed by him and all kinds of other kind of garbage that ultimately this guy has amassed to fame and fortune and whatever. So Simon is reasonably having women seemingly throwing themselves at him, basically taking their shirts off right in front of him to offer him money to get Cable every single time. I'm assuming this is the same offer over and over and over again, because it seems to the point to where even uh, Simon's sister even knows the exact same pitch that they do numerous times over. So these are people that consistently probably go into Simon's social medias or hack through to get to him and consistently talk to him, and it's the same stuff over and over again. We have one girl who was ultimately telling Simon, it's like, hey man, like, you need to win this because I need to get Simon. Like, he's my boyfriend, and I just want be able uh, to be able, after he gets out of prison, I want him to be able to be mine, and this and that, and so Simon's just like, whatever, like, I don't care. Like, I have nothing to do with that. Like, whatever, shut up. And we have, like, one girl who has her, like, seemingly entire tongue just, like, pierced, like, to where Simon is, like, asking, like, hey, let me see your tongue. And, like, you can just see her entire tongue is just pierced. And I'm like, oh my God. I'm like, man, like, one, hopefully all, like, probably all that is, like, cosmetically added on and whatever, but, like, still, that whole, like, visual is just like, like, somebody had to put that in their, like, somebody had to put that all throughout their tongue, and they had to, like, keep it in there while saying all those words. Like, I could just imagine how, like, unless they edited it to where it was just like, well, she doesn't have all this stuff while saying the words, but then eventually when she takes out her tongue, we're gonna give her this cosmetic to. We're gonna put this on her tongue, and then ultimately she's gonna and then show the whole thing. I'm like, God, that was crazy looking. So, anyways, pushing on to this guy getting through all of his, like, people that all have to talk to him today, to either showcase that this guy is a real. This guy is hugely popular. You would think to the point this guy wouldn't have time to play any games with all the women and the people and the things that he all has to do. Like, reasonably, you probably have, like, huge upper echelons of YouTubers that are getting, like, their emails just, like, crushed with just tons and tons of things that they have to like they have to just fling all the way through. And I'm sure, like, people's emails gets, like, filled to the brim all the time. So, as well as Twitters and tweets and all ever whatever the heck else that these people have, Facebooks and so on and so forth. So, anyways, we get it to where Simon is ultimately playing around with Cable, and so we are ultimately eventually going to see how this is actually done, how this is actually showcased, how this is brought together. Because ultimately we have Simon that is playing as Gerard Butler for a round. So we have it to where each one of the things that they do have to be like copied, and I thought that that was really interesting. So we eventually get to the point to where Simon ultimately is getting mods from Ludacris's character to ultimately eventually be able to talk to Cable's character, and of course he ends up saying yes to it. And so we now have it to where the girl who is whispering to Cable is saying, "Hey, yeah, like your player is going to be able to talk to you," and ultimately, like it seems like Simon Moore is more is willing to want to be is willing to want to help Cable and also just get a bunch of mods going to where ultimately they can kind of help Cable a lot more to try to win this game. Even to the point where the humans are ultimately talking to Simon and ultimately saying, "Hey, we're going to give you mods. We're ultimately going to have you just let at some point Gerard Butler roam free with being able to kill whoever he wants without the ping of the player forcing him to do any number of things." So we have within here the interesting part where we have Gerard who is now hearing the player for the first time, and it is seemingly in this onslaught of things going on, these like motorcycles flying all over the place, and we ultimately have John Leguizamo's character who had talked to Gerard Butler's character earlier about and talked in like crazy like talk where he's like, Tillsman, you're so scary and you spook me, you're spooky and all this other. And then ultimately we have to where John Leguizamo is kind of telling Cable about the other people, which so John Leguizamo is kind of like telling people who everyone is by when they come in, so that way we know who they are, and so also I guess Cable will too. So so we eventually have Hackman come in here, and he is the very menacing, very like in your face killer of sorts. And so recently we had the first round before Hackman goes into here, um, where Simon is having fun with Cable. He's kind of doing like the weird little dances and stuff like that, while also also Cable is asking, "How am I not dead yet?" Like, and Simon's just like, "Cause I'm good." And he's like, "What are you, like 12?" And he's like, "No, I'm 17." It's like, I wouldn't have thought that. So we have pushing on to like Cable is trying to figure out like and talk to this kid, and he's like, how am I able to talk to you? Like normally we wouldn't be able to talk to players before, and it's like, well, that's because this got modded in and it's really cool. So more and more there we kind of have Simon who's kind of like screwing around, and Cable is really calling him on it. And so Simon is getting his together and leading it to where almost Hackman almost gets the jump on Cable and almost kills him, to where they end up having the escape route right where Cable's character and Hackman's character are, to where it kind of nullifies and has it to where Hackman and Cable end up getting pulled apart. We have to where Cable is thinking, dude, I could have been killed just then. Like somebody was trying to off me. Like if anything, like me being controlled by you, Simon, is not going to work. So, like, if anything, you need to cut the strings. You need to let me be free. You need to figure out how to do this. And so eventually, the humans are ultimately talking to Simon. It's like, hey, like, you heard what the man said, play it. Like, are you gonna cut his strings? Or are you ultimately no longer gonna be his puppet master and ultimately let him be able to play the game? Because ultimately, Hackman has no strings, so now Cable has to have no strings. So pushing us on to Simon having to agree with this, and so we have the girl again whispering to Gerard Butler. It's like, hey, like he's gonna let you go on your own. Is there anything that you're gonna need? And ultimately, Cable says, I'm gonna need to get drunk. So recently, Cable finds a bottle with his equipment, and ultimately Simon had given Cable this new equipment, this upgrade that ultimately he had to test. So we eventually have it to where Cable is drinking this thing of alcohol, which he shouldn't have done, and ultimately it seems that the cameras notice him drinking this alcohol. Like, hey, put it down, and he's gobbling this thing up, and he's throwing the glass at the camera. So we have it to where Simon gets into the game, and ultimately Cable is just so drunk he's like not even able to really function, and Simon is just like, oh my god, why did I let you take control? If anything, like you're gonna die right away, and this is all gonna be meaningless. And Cable is giving him crap. He's just like, yeah, why don't you shut up, cheerleader? It's like, cause yeah, like Simon is just like so like disappointed on Cable's performance and stuff like that. It's like, well, yeah, that's because he's freaking drunk. So through this round, we have to where Cable is going through a area of which that is restricted, and he Simon couldn't help him get to that section, and so recently Gerard goes anyways, and ultimately goes into one of these trucks, and ultimately vomits into the truck of the alcohol, so that way the alcohol is the fuel for the truck, and so reasonably we have Gerard Butler just kind of driving away onto this truck. And so we have Hackman who is trying to desperately get to Gerard's character, and ultimately we have Gerard who smashes Hackman off of his truck, and he just keeps on driving along to ultimately we are showcased that supposedly Cable had been killed, that ultimately rockets had shot onto a rocket launcher of sorts had shot onto this truck, ultimately killing Cable, and that's where supposedly that video had ended with the annihilation supposedly of Cable, and ultimately people are mentioning that, oh yeah, Cable, rest in peace, he's dead. This it's Arnold Schwarzenegger Running Man all over again, where it's like, hey, yeah, we have to just tell people that Cable is dead now, even though he really isn't. Cable is outside the game now, ultimately working with the humans. He had snuck away, and ultimately we have Trace, who is the girl that was talking to him the entire time in the prison, ultimately now sneaking him into the humans' headquarters. We ultimately have to also say that that Cable's character is going to get unplugged and ultimately be free seemingly for a certain amount of time from the Slayer's game of being controlled. So, pushing us on to ultimately say that Cable was never going to be able to beat this game. He was never going to win because ultimately he has so much information against Ken Castle that recently there was no way for this person to get to be free. Like, there's no way. So we find out that ultimately Cable is going to try to jailbreak his wife and also find his child, his kid. So we have a whole entire scenario where Cable is breaking into society, the game, to ultimately find Angie, who is now being within this game as a character for a male person. So we have it to where Cable has to track down Angie, and when he does, he ultimately is telling her that he loves her, and the entire time the player is telling him like, "Oh, I love you too," and all this stuff, and Cable like, "Shut up, shut up, player. I know that's not you, but I know that she can hear me. Um, like if anything, if you say another word, like I will find you and I will kill you." And so we eventually also have Hackman, who is also trying to not only find Cable, but also find Angie. And so reasonably, we get to, at some point, Cable and Hackman having to, like, there's kind of a lot of inception or interception going on where we have to where Terry at some point gets Angie in the elevator, and ultimately he tells, like, he asks her, is like, "Hey, is there a player in there?" To where, of course, the player replies, "Yeah." To ultimately, Terry ends up killing someone in the elevator, and ultimately the player ends up enjoying the death of somebody in this elevator, um, and so on and so forth. So we end up to where eventually Cable is ultimately trying to get Angie back, and eventually he does, and to ultimately because ultimately they have to go through all this nightclub and all this stuff to eventually kind of run through and get Angie back, and eventually they do so. To ultimately they now have to like disconnect Angie from the player server. To ultimately no one's going to control her for a period of time. So, excuse me, pushing this off. We just gotta keep pushing through this entire movie. There's so much crap going on in this film. Visually interesting, yeah, but there's so much stuff going on, and there's a lot of technical jargon at some points for a lot of these things. So we ultimately have Cable and Angie together, and now Cable is, of course, Tillsman is ultimately asking like, "Hey, where's our daughter?" And they find out that recently her daughter had been adopted out by a wealthy family, but ultimately Trace is ultimately telling them that there is a way to be able to figure out who had adopted their child. There's always a paper trail somewhere, and they'll be able to figure this out. Well, they end up finding out that ultimately Ken Castle owns Cable and Angie's daughter. So, of course, Cable, of course, goes into Ken Castle's home to ultimately retrieve his daughter. Ultimately, instead of retrieving his daughter, he ends up having to fight people instead. Because recently, the thing of which that he thought was his daughter was just a video or a TV screen. It looked very realistic. To ultimately, Michael C. Hall's character Ken was like, "Yeah, like man, look how real that looks." Like, could you imagine when eventually uh, we'll get adult videos on that. He said something different, but I ultimately am trying to eschew some words from popping up through YouTube. So we have to where pushing off to it now being Michael C. Hall wanting to do a fight with Gerard Butler's character, but reasonably, they have to do it in a very fun, showy kind of way. And so we have to where Michael C. Hall is doing this like string like showcase, uh, placating to an old song called "Under My Skin, Deep in the Heart of Me," blah blah blah, like showcasing that Michael has so much control of any number of people to try to take out Gerard Butler's character. So we have him coming along, dancing around, but then there are other seemingly prison inmates that are going to be coming into the fray to be controlled by uh, the other the other geek gamer people that are working under Michael C. Hall, and they are controlling all the prison characters that are going to take out Gerard Butler. But of course, they are not going to take out Gerard Butler. So recently, Michael C. Hall leaves to where ultimately we have all these prison inmates going out to be slaughtered by Gerard Butler, punched, incapacitated, to the point to where Gerard Butler has to follow uh, Ken Castle's character out to this basketball court, where eventually here's where we have Ken Castle's character breaking down the science of it all. How basically he at some point is going to be able to control the entire world because everybody is eventually going to become a player of his game because it's inevitable. Everybody is either going to become a player or everyone is eventually going to become a society member or a slayer, or this world is completely going down the toilet, like the healthcare isn't exactly what it is anymore. And so reasonably everybody is just clamoring to forcibly be a slayer or a society member because reasonably health benefits are better, or just like they would get more money doing this than they could do doing anything else, like druggies or drug dealers or whoever that just desperately needs money will go into doing society or go into doing slayers just because they fall into the cracks of so many things. So we have it to where Ken Castle is breaking down how he's going to be able to eventually control everyone. Because if anything, he is a person that is, instead of receiving a signal from somewhere, he is sending a signal to people. So that way he can be able to control anybody that ultimately has had nanites put into his head. We also eventually find out that 98% of Ken Castle's head had been nanited out and whatever. So we find out that there had been a some experiments, some test trials, and unfortunately, we find out within Cable's brain that Cable had shot a man during an experiment that he could not control. Because ultimately, Ken Castle was controlling Cable's mind to ultimately shoot a man called I think his name was Travis Scotch, which ultimately is a very weird name. ultimately these guys were doing these test trials. Ultimately these guys were being experimented on. Ultimately Travis was mentioning about blackouts and stuff like that. And we find out that Gerard Butler's character just wanted to shoot Travis. And so reasonably since Ken Castle's character had done this murder, we and Cable had took the rap for it. We find out that Gerard knows too much. Gerard characters knows too much. He knows about all the experiments that happened even before society was a real thing or Slayers was a real thing. He was on the ground floor for everything. So making Gerard's character the one person that, of course, Ken Castle wanted under his thumb for however long. So now that Cable is here talking to Castle, and Castle is breaking down how like using powder on the fingertips of his hands, ultimately he can control everybody, and by a slap of his with the slap of his hands, like how the dust will just eventually like go everywhere, and how he can be everywhere, explaining this in layman's terms. So we have to where people on the outside, Gina and Trace and whoever is left, because we also found out that Ken Castle had intercepted the Humans headquarters and basically been able to knock them most of them all unconscious and take control of their headquarters. So ultimately the only real threat is basically taken out or taken care of supposedly. But we ultimately have it to where Trace and Gina, who is again Kira Sedgwick, is turning on online the uplinks to the Slayer and or Society game. And so now through Cable's eyes, showcasing all over the world, we have Ken Castle talking about his plan, talking about his control, and so ultimately live on TV, we are seeing Ken Cable basically talking about how he's going to master the world and how he's gonna reasonably just like dominate. So we have where to where Ken eventually throws in Terry Crews for Cable to have to beat down, break his arm, and basically break his neck and kill him. We eventually have it to where Cable eventually wants to try to kill Castle by grabbing a knife to otherwise kill Castle, but Castle won't allow it. So instead, Cable ends up like repetitiously kung fu wise beating Cable up because Cable can't really do anything, and then dropping him onto the ground. And Cable ultimately sees his wife and daughter, and so he tries to make it to them and tries to get up, but Castle says no, you have to crawl to them. Ultimately he does, to ultimately almost have to kill his own daughter. But the Slayer and Society games are back online to where Simon is seeing this whole thing unfold, and it seems like he is quasi going to be able to get control of his Cable, his character. So reasonably we have to where instead of like we have Cable who is fighting on not killing his daughter, instead we have to where Simon is controlling Cable to get him to almost slice open Castle, but Castle stops it. So we have Castle going, what the heck happened? What just happened here? Like, I should have been able to control him. And we ultimately have it to where the tech guys are saying, oh no, well, we ran into a snag. Ultimately, somebody turned on the uplink to all the players. Somebody turned this whole thing on, and ultimately, the player is controlling Cable's ability to slice you now. So Simon is like going, yeah, like we're gonna get him, like yeah, we're gonna do this, because ultimately there was a cluster of because ultimately Simon had to go to jail because ultimately he was funding and orchestrating the assist of getting a convicted felon out of prison. And so ultimately, we have it to where every person that ever liked him was calling him a cheater and a phony and a whatever through spam messages. But eventually, he makes it up for the fact that he tries to help Cable out by killing a Castle. So we have it to where Cable is ultimately like he's stuck trying to get Castle to die, and so Cable is telling Castle, "Hey, like imagine the knife going in your gut, like imagine it." And so ultimately, I guess Castle is to imagine it, and so the blade actually goes into Castle's stomach, and now he is stabbed, of course. So we have it to where Castle is dying, and so reasonably now everything is supposedly over with. We have all the techies and the geeks or whatever who are starting to walk away, and Gerard Butler is like, hey, free all of us. Like, it's just a mouse click to you, free us all. So, of course, they do so, and then they're like, hey, well played. So, we have to where they are just kind of driving off into the sunset, ultimately with the arm tattoo of "I'm right here with you" on Gerard's arm as kind of like a mantra, and like that ending to me is kind of like the ending to Legion. Like it kind of feels like the same ending with all of the guns and stuff in the back of the car, but still it kind of feels like the same thing. Um, but yeah, I enjoy this movie. Yeah, like there's some stuff about it where it kind of feels kind of clunky or kind of feels a little like again it's not a movie for everybody, but it was a movie good enough for me. So ultimately that's all I wanted to say about Gamer, but I'm going to get out of here so I can do other things today, finish up some recordings, get out of here. Goodbye everybody. Goodbye everybody.